I'm gonna give you some credit. Do you know how many mass shooters there have been in America over the last 10 years?
Counting or not counting gang violence?
Great.
What you're about to see isn't a contradiction. It's a transformation. In just a few short years, Turning Point USA, the organization led by the late Charlie Kirk, went from a group focused on small government, campus activism, to a driving force for an aggressive, uncompromising form of Christian nationalism. How does a shift that big happen? How does an organization built on free markets and fiscal responsibility suddenly start talking about spiritual warfare and taking dominion over a nation? It doesn't happen by accident. It's guided, it's funded, and it's driven by a handful of people with specific theological agendas. This is an investigation into the key players and the timeline behind how TPUSA was steered from a campus club into a powerful engine for a little-known but highly influential movement, the New Apostolic Reformation. We're going to look at the evidence pointing to who was behind this pivot, how they did it, and what it means for the future of American politics. This isn't just a story about Charlie Kirk. It's about the men who corrupted him in the name of God. To really grasp how radical this change was, you have to remember what Turning Point USA used to be. Most people today were introduced to Charlie Kirk either in the lead up to the 2024 presidential campaign or via his assassination. So they see him as a warrior for Christianity. But the beginning was quite different. When Charlie Kirk co-founded TPUSA in 2012 at just the age of 18, the mission was clear. Identify, educate, train, and organize students to promote the principles and fiscal responsibility, free markets, and limited government. It was designed to be a conservative counterpart to young people groups like MoveOn.org. For years, that was their brand. They set up tables on college campuses, handed out buttons, and debated students on tax policy. Their official focus was on the Constitution and the morality of capitalism. Religion wasn't even part of the public pitch. In fact, for the first several years of TPUSA's existence, Kirk argued for keeping faith and politics separate. Though he was raised in an evangelical family, he seemed to draw a line. The most explicit evidence comes from a 2018 interview where he was asked directly by Dave Rubin about the role of religion in politics, and he gave a grounded and cocksure answer. Let's watch.
But how did that happen?
Well, so I think what happened is that Christian conservatives fell for a trap that they really should have rejected, which is we might hold these truths very near and dear to our heart, theologically and biblically and spiritually and religiously. But I think where the line was crossed is in the 60s and 70s and 80s, where we tried to impose those beliefs through government policy, where people then inherently have a rejection to it. Similarly, how people are rejecting the left, imposing their crazy worldview upon us, right? I think that was a big mistake because it created this kind of counter-revolution, which is, I don't want to have to live the way some Christian in Alabama wants me to live. Does that make sense? So it's the imposition of those values through legislation and government, which is something I don't necessarily support, right? So I try to always advocate for every one of my political positions through a secular worldview, because that is the vast majority of people, and that's actually the government system that we have all decided to create. We do have a separation of church and state, and we should support that. With that being said, I can still have my own personal opinions, my own personal, ways to go about changing public policy. But when we start to say we should support this law because it's the Christian thing to do, that is, I think, that has turned people off for the last 30 years.
What does it say?
He thought that mixing the two was a mistake. It wasn't just an off-the-cuff remark. It was part of TPUSA strategy. TPUSA activists were often trained to focus on economics and avoid getting bogged down in divisive social issues. The goal was building a broad coalition of young conservatives, and that meant having a big tent for all conservatives. Their stated enemy was socialism and big government, not secularism. In fact, TPUSA's handbook from 21 and 22 doesn't even mention faith. But as the political landscape shifted, A new set of figures saw an opportunity. They saw Kirk's charisma and his growing platform as a vehicle for something far more ambitious than conservative economics, and something much darker. Stay tuned, because next we're going to look at the men who began to corrupt Charlie Kirk. The year 2020 changed everything. The pressures of a global pandemic, nationwide lockdowns, and a polarizing presidential campaign created a chaotic environment. For Turning Point USA, it also created opportunity. As college campuses shut down, TPUSA's main recruiting grounds disappeared. The bread and butter had run out. At the same time, a cultural firestorm was brewing over public health restrictions, especially those limiting church gatherings. And this is where a new cast of characters enters the story. Figures who would fundamentally alter the DNA of Charlie Kirk's organization. One of the most pivotal figures is Rob McCoy. McCoy's a pastor from Godspeak Calvary Chapel in California and a former mayor of Thousand Oaks. He gained national attention for openly defying COVID-19 lockdown orders, an act of defiance that made him a hero in the movement framing public health measures as an attack on religious freedoms. McCoy, who would become Kirk's pastor and co-founder of TPUSA Faith, met Kirk in 2019 and allegedly convinced him that America's founding documents were derived from the Ten Commandments.
Going back to this idea of separation of church and state, and again, I could riff on this ad nauseum because it's just so ridiculous, right? Is that it's not constitutional, because you go a layer deeper. People that even say that, do you believe in separation of morality and state? Nobody does. So all laws are a reflection of morality, and all morality comes from somewhere. There is no such thing as neutral morality. And we believe what the founders believed, because they put it in the halls of Congress, they put it in the Supreme Court, and they put it all throughout the country, which is that the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, is the core morality of how a society and a civilization should exist, right?
That clip is a stark contrast to Charlie's previous beliefs on the Dave Rubin show just a couple of years earlier. McCoy is aligned with a powerful and controversial theological movement, the New Apostolic Reformation, or NAR, a quasi-Christian cult with deep ties to the military-industrial complex and all three branches of government. The NAR isn't a formal denomination. It's a network of big church leaders who believe God is restoring the offices of apostles and prophets to the modern church. And they believe that these new apostles and prophets have divine authority to wage spiritual warfare against demonic forces in society. Central to this ideology is a doctrine called the Seven Mountains Mandate. And this teaches that for Christ to return, Christians must take dominion over 7 key mountains or spheres of influence: government, media, business, education, religion, family, and arts and entertainment. A young, naive, and impressionable Charlie was on board with this idea. On the surface, it appears to be in direct opposition to the cultural Marxism and socialist movements from the left, taking back the institutions that fell under their influence. But in reality, it's a theological blueprint for achieving a strict Christian influence in every aspect of public life. Rob McCoy became a guide for Kirk into this world, using NAR recruitment tactics like love bombing and ideological bait, and then targeting Charlie's naivety with new revelations, and soon Kirk's public persona began to shift. He started aligning with other charismatic figures like worship leader Sean Foyt, who is also associated with the NAR movement. Foyt himself has come under scrutiny as of late with allegations of fraud and spiritual abuse, which are common in the cult-like practices of the NAR. But at the time, Foyt was leading Let Us Worship rallies across the country, which were part worship service, part concert, and part protest against COVID restrictions. TPUSA Faith partnered with Foyt for his Kingdom to the Capitol tour, a series of revival-style events at all 50 state capitals. And suddenly, TPUSA wasn't just debating economics, it was holding massive outdoor worship services. Instead of big tent politics, TPUSA was becoming big tent evangelism. Then came the moment that signaled the NAR to begin executing their plan for dominion. Speaking at CPAC in February 2020, Charlie Kirk publicly used explicit language of the NAR. While praising President Trump, Kirk said, "Finally, we have a president that understands the 7 mountains of cultural influence." Let's watch.
Try walking around Brown, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, UCLA with that hat. But I'll tell you, finally, we have a president that understands the 7 mountains of cultural influence. Finally, we have a president that understands.
It was quick and subtle, but for those inside the NAR movement, this was a clear signal. The young activist known for his focus on economics was now speaking their language, signaling that Turning Point was ready to join the crusade toward dominion. With Kirk given the signal, the transformation of TPUSA from a political organization to a political religious movement accelerated. And the pivot wasn't just talk, it became institutional. In 2021, the alliance was formalized with the launch of a brand new division, TPUSA Faith. Rob McCoy, who had become a spiritual mentor to Kirk, was co-founder and public face of the new initiative. Its stated mission was aggressive: to awaken believers to their biblical responsibility to fight for freedom and return to foundational Christian values. The focus shifted from students in lecture halls to pastors in their congregations. TPUSA Faith rolled out programs designed to mobilize churches, including Freedom Night in America events hosted in churches and biblical citizenship classes to help congregations run voter registration drives. On the surface, the goal was to help transform churches and hubs for conservative activism. Beneath that, the goal was dominion. And the rhetoric changed dramatically. Kirk himself began preaching a hot gospel, casting political contests in stark spiritual terms. And by 2022, the man who had once defended the separation of church and state was now calling it a fabrication. This new direction brought another key figure into Kirk's orbit, Lance Wallnau. Wallnau, a self-described prophet, is one of the most prominent advocates of the 7 Mountains Mandate. He teaches that Christians are in a spiritual war and must invade the 7 mountains of culture to establish God's kingdom on earth. Kirk began appearing frequently with Wallnau in 2024. Wallnau and TPUSA Faith announced a Courage Tour, targeting churches in key swing states to promote the America First agenda. This alliance solidified the doctrinal link. Kirk was now actively partnering with architects of the New Apostolic Reformation Dominion theology to achieve political ends. So why the shift? While it's impossible to know for sure, what I gather from this investigation is that it was a combination of strategic necessity and ideological influence. The 2020 lockdowns presented a tactical problem for TPUSA. Its campus-based model was suddenly obsolete. The anti-lockdown church movement, led by figures like Rob McCoy, offered a new, energized fight against big government and overreach. By the same token, the NAR needed a new infusion of young and able-bodied Christians to prepare for dominion, and Kirk was the young man who could deliver that to them. It was a strategic masterstroke for both sides, tapping into pre-organized networks of conservatives ready to be mobilized. But it was also an ideological transformation. By embracing the NAR and 7 Mountains Mandate, Kirk didn't just find a new audience, he was corrupted into a new worldview, seemingly influenced by men like McCoy and Wallnau, who saw politics as a holy war. This narrative was powerful. Political opponents weren't just wrong, they were demonic forces to be conquered, and Charlie desperately wanted to be a crusader. This fusion also had real-world consequences. In the lead up to January 6th, Kirk's political arm, Turning Point Action, announced it was sending 80-plus buses full of patriots to stop the Steal rally that preceded the Capitol riot. Later, court filings for one of the rioters charged with assaulting police confirmed that he had traveled to D.C. on a bus organized by Turning Point. And the movement continued to grow. In 2021, it was decided that they needed to make Charlie over into the quintessential evangelical. That means Charlie would need a wife and kids. Charlie would need to appear to lead a life of a good Christian with a traditional wife and ally to help push the Christian narrative. Enter Erica Franzwe, later Erica Kirk, a former Miss Arizona beauty queen with military-industrial complex and Zionist ties. She was known by Rob McCoy and Andrew Colvett, who was also brought in to help promote TPUSA and TPUSA Faith. Colvette was allegedly responsible for the initial meeting between Erica and Charlie. By 2024, Kirk was one of the most powerful voices in conservative politics, and TPUSA Faith was a key part of that infrastructure. The NAR had their people in high places, with evangelicals like Kirk preaching the Seven Mountains Mandate doctrine, and Paula White Cain and Speaker Mike Johnson in President Trump's ear. The stage was set to claim dominion. Then on September 10th, 2025, during a campus event at Utah Valley University, Charlie Kirk was assassinated. He was shot and killed in what authorities labeled a targeted political assassination. His death sent shockwaves across the country and instantly transformed him from a political activist into a martyr for a cause that he had come to champion. In the aftermath, the organization rallied. His widow, Erica Kirk, was appointed the new CEO and chair of the board, vowing to continue her husband's work. A memorial message on the TPUSA website reads, "The fire Charlie lit is burning brighter than ever. Now the responsibility is ours. This is the time to fight harder." The movement Kirk built with the help of men like Rob McCoy now had its ultimate symbol, a martyr, their very own Jesus for dominion. His legacy, intertwined with his tragic death, ensures that the fusion of Christian nationalism and political warfare that he championed will continue, likely with even greater fervor. Let's trace the path one last time. An organization focused on economics pivots hard around 2020. Guided by Pastor Rob McCoy, its leader Charlie Kirk embraces the theology of the New Apostolic Reformation. They adopt the Seven Mountains Mandate, a blueprint for Christian dominion over society. They formalize this with TPUSA Faith, building a machine to mobilize churches for political action. They align with NAR thought leaders like Lance Wallnau, solidifying their place in a movement that sees politics as a holy war. This wasn't an evolution. It was an ideological acquisition. The infrastructure of Turning Point was captured by an aggressive and uncompromising brand of Christian nationalism. And the men who appear to have guided this pivot, McCoy and Wallnau, were architects of Kirk's new mission. The tragic death of Charlie Kirk has only cemented this legacy, turning a political movement into a martyr's cause. The questions that remain are for us to answer. What does it mean for a democracy when a major political apparatus views its opponents as demonic forces? What happens when the separation of church and state is no longer seen as a principle to protect, but as a fabrication to be torn down? I firmly believe that had Charlie Kirk kept Turning Point a secular organization focused on free markets and the Constitution of the United States, that he would still be alive today. The story of Turning Point USA is a case study in how political movements can be captured and hijacked by radical ideologies. Understanding that decentralized cult figures behind the NAR and its alliance with Israel do exist. And it's the first step in recognizing the challenge that this poses to our free and sovereign society. Donald Trump is under this same influence, handled by apostles like Paula White Cain and prophets like Cindy Jacobs. And he's nudged by high-ranking NAR enforcers like Speaker Mike Johnson. I worry for our president, and I worry for our Constitution. And I don't think that any of this is holy. Anyway, thanks for listening.